Good evening. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much for the welcoming. Really, I'm delighted to be here today, and I thank the Oxford Union very much for its gracious invitation given to me a couple of months back. Thank you in particular to Stephen Hofer, who has been supporting me to go all the way to come here. I feel privileged to stand here among bright, gifted, dedicated minds, knowing who has spoken before me here in this hall and knowing the future potential that lies here among you. I have spent my life in education and of course slightly in a different setting, which is in Somalia. The difference between education institution in Somalia and the Oxford Union, I think many people can imagine how the gap is big, but at the end, the spirit is the same. I cannot tell you how meaningful it is for me to be here at Oxford. I acknowledge the excellency you stand for, the ideas birthed here, and the rich perspective you will go on to give the world as a result of your time here in Oxford. Before I begin, you should understand one thing about Somalia, which I will be talking soon, and the Somalis as well, which we may have in common things with the Oxford Union. We love to talk, we Somalis, and of course here as well. When in Somalia, when I start to make a lecture or talking, people will think that I speak in a very short period of time when I spoke a couple of hours. But tonight I'm not going to give you that hard time. Before I begin, I'm thankful for this opportunity again to share with you today a little about Somalia. For many, including sadly many major news networks, Somalia is still an unknown place. According a country known more through the myths told about it than through the reality. Of course, it's largely synonymous with some Hollywood movies which are very famous, like The Black Hawk Down. How many people have watched The Black Hawk Down? Great. And what about Captain Phillips? Many people in the world, when they heard the word Somalia, they immediately get those two movies and many others that the world has provided to us to know about Somalia. But the reality is completely different than Black Hawk Down and Captain. In a battlefield, there is always difficulties and problems, but the one of Black Hawk Down was very unique, and it has changed a little bit about Somalia in the course of its travel to reach a peaceful settlement. People know we have sharks, since we have the longest coastline in the African continent. Still, that's very famous, and you must have heard some international expatriates who lost some of their limbs in the coasts of Somalia where they were swimming in those beautiful beaches. Today, I hope to shift this perspective a little bit to incite your curiosity and perhaps apply a little what I have learned in my time as a teacher, as a researcher, as a civil society activist, and in more recently as the President of the Federal Republic of Somalia. And remain now still a politician in Somalia, being a president who finished his term peacefully. I got the credit to remain a permanent member of the parliament in the rest of my life in Somalia. And recently I have established a new political party, since Somalia is experiencing now a new trend of politics which is ruled and controlled by the political parties. The Union for Peace and Development Party is newly established in Somalia. Let me now contextualize the realities in Somalia so that you can understand or you can shape your own imagination on Somalia. Let me contextualize the reality of Somalia in the first 2 decades of 21st century. I will take 2 individuals. This is an imaginary story, but it's a reality in Somalia, the individuals I'm talking about. There were 2 brothers, one called it Ali and the other called it Abdi. One was 5 years old and the other one was 7 years old in 1991. That's the school going age mainly in Somalia. And in 1991 early was the time when the Somali state completely collapsed. There was fragile statehood that was going on for a couple of years, but in 1991, that was the time when the Somali state completely collapsed. Their parents, these 2 boys, when the collapse happened, took them to a very, very remote village where the parents originally come from. Hence, they didn't get any opportunity to go to school. They never went to school. And in 2012, both were 26 years and 28 years old, who grew up in that remote village. At that age, most probably they are fathers. They married and got kids at that age normally in Somalia, and in particularly in the last 30 years when the problem was existing. By being in that remote area, by not exposed to any training or any kind of education, their capacity or their ability to be employed, if there is any employment, was 0, number 1. Number 2, normally in a village like that, people either they farm or they rear livestock. Both opportunities they missed because there was a lack of security. So they were not able to farm, they were not able to rear livestock. Their livestock either has been looted and taken away. So these boys, which Somalia's population, close to 70% are categorized as a youth. This is across the board in many situations, in many areas in Somalia. These boys, they cannot buy a cup of milk for their kids. They cannot support their elderly, ailing parents that are there. So they are so confused, very angry, very afraid, and very unstable. One good morning, a ringleader for pirates come to Ali, the elder one. And then he explained to his dilemma, the dilemma that he is in. And then he also presented the solutions. He said, come and join us by not saying we are going to be pirates, but saying we are defending our territorial water. Since we don't have coast guards and navy, we are the young people who are supposed to defend our territorial waters by illegal fishing, by people who are dumping toxic wastes in our ocean. So we go and defend, and accordingly we will get a handsome reward. So the boy, he went with that guy, and he, unfortunately, in his first trip, he was detained, taken to Seychelles, and convicted for 10 years imprisonment. He didn't come back. When he was away for 2 weeks, another guy who is a recruiter for Al-Shabaab came the other boy and said, this is what you are going to do. Your brother is not here anymore. Join us. We'll we will compensate you accordingly. And what is that compensation? $50 a month. I would like to emphasize, most of the fighting force with Al-Shabaab, they are not there for ideological reasons. They are there for economic reason, or they are there for a revenge purpose by some other major clans who have subjected to harsh environment. So the old father and the old mother, they lost the two sons. They have taken away from major cities in order to avoid the civil war, the conflict, the killing, and come back to their original or traditional place to stay. The parents of these young boys got the news later on that a new president is elected in Somalia. One who will lead a government that is not a transition. We have a prolonged transition. Transitional government is established in Somalia in 2000 until 2012. We have 12 years of transition, which is one of the longest transitional governments that the world has experienced. So now this news has come, that a new president has elected. This new president will lead a permanent government, a government that is not in transition. A transitional government has a characteristics that is completely different from a permanent or stable government. Their first prayer, the mother and the father, their first prayer was, of course, to see their sons again, hoping to go back to their home in the city where they left 22 years ago. For them, the election of the new president that leads a permanent government is a panacea for all their problems. That is the perception that has been developed in 2012. Now, and that was the time in September 2012 when I was elected as the president, the first president that leads a government that is not in transition. It's the first president that takes the full responsibility of building a functional state institutions that functions throughout the country. Now, let me set the scene for what was going to happen under my leadership. In 2012, let me take you as an example that you were elected as a president. You have never been president before, never been a minister before, never been a politician before. After 22 years of difficult environment, you become to be the first president to be elected after 10 years of civil war, after 12 years of successive transitional governments. The establishment of this permanent non-transitional government has taken the expectation of the people more than anything else. Now I want to, what was the real environment that president has come. The state revenue at that time was less than $60 million a year. The state revenue. To give you an idea of how far that money can be stretched to provide useful services to the people is, you have only 2 pence to spend on education per child, to spend an education per school-aged child, 2 cents only per year you have. And you have millions of young kids who want to see school, which has never happened. The last time that public schools functioned was 1990. Since 2012, there has never been one single public school available to the poor people. There are private schools, those who can afford. But for the bulk of the people, the majority of the population, they don't have schooling at all. There are more than 100 clans in Somalia, each of whom thinks that Somalia should be governed by them. Clan X, Clan Y, Clan Z, each of them believes that I am the one who is supposed to govern Somalia. Much of the country in general thinks that half of Somalia is missing because of the colonial history of Somalia. Many Somalis believe that half of Somalia was lost during the colonial era, and now they are part of Kenya, or they are part of Ethiopia, or they are Djibouti. So we call it the 5 Somalis, which happened in the Scramble to Africa, the Berlin Conference of 1884, how Africa was divided. Unfortunately, Somalia was divided into zones of influence. So we have only 2 Somalis now constituting the Federal Republic of Somalia, but many people do believe that we lost 3 Somalis to this now. So there are people who are still fixed to that mentality. You have no federal institution. We have a constitution that indicates that Somalia is a federal state, the Federal Republic of Somalia. But we don't have the federal institutions that links the peripheries and the center, that provides the greasing, oiling to avoid friction between the center and the peripheries. You have the legal code is largely written in Arabic or in Italian language. Both are not national language. Most of the young people aged 25 years or less, they have never been in school at all. There is no functioning industry where people can get some sort of employment. You have a weaponized, armed, coordinated domestic terrorist group who controls close to 80% of the territory in Somalia at the time. The international community finally has funds to spend in Somalia, but they don't want to actually come to Somalia, the real Somalia. They put a fence around the international airport with more than 24 troops from the African Union protecting them on their side of the fence and not on the other side. And a Somali to go into that fence, he has to get a permission. Otherwise, he cannot go in. Or the international community stays in Nairobi, almost a 3-hour flight with a lot of difficult immigration processes that goes there. So there is a distance between the Somalis and under this situation, the high expectation of millions like the parents I mentioned above, the question is, what are you going to do first? What is your priority? There is a long list of needs, and every need is priority. So deciding which to do, the first thing to do, is a big question. This may seem some sort of fictional story, but this was the truth of the situation when my colleagues and I formed the first government in 2012. We were building a state basically out of a sand, which is impossible to keep it now. Now, up until 2012, most Somalis belong to one of 2 groups. Both of their basis is a fear. The first group, whose main fear was the state itself, because Somalia has experienced a predatory state that has done all the bad things to the people, killing, looting, raping, everything that the people were expecting from the government was lost, and this was the result. That's one group. They're afraid of state. When they hear the state building, state program, this is the president, this is the minister, they immediately get scared that this is going to come back again after 20 years. That was one group of Somalis. So convincing them, telling them that the state is a neutral institution that serves you, that provides you services that are needed, was not easy to convince the people. The other group was when the civil war took place, you know, in everywhere there is a major, minor, major clans, minor clans. There are minority in some parts of Somalia. So a lot of people have been misused. A lot of people have been abused by taking their property, by killing their people, by displacing them. So this group, they are afraid of the statelessness. One group afraid the state, another group, their fear is based on the stateless. When there is no state, what's going to happen? And then they see those major or bigger clans who abused them now becoming the state by themselves. Because who is the president, who is the prime minister, who is the speaker of the house, who is the minister? Mostly they see these major clans again occupying this place, and then the fear comes back to them. So in that context, many people now urged reconciliation, reconciliation, reconciliation. We knew that we could not move forward to build a lasting peace without forgiveness, without reconciliation. I was, and I'm still committed absolutely to the process of reconciliation, but it's not simple. Reconciliation is not simple by itself. There are two important prerequisites in any reconciliation to be a long-lasting one. The first is to believe it is a process. If you consider the reconciliation, social reconciliation in particular, is an event that we get together, we hug each other, we said, I forgive you, and we leave, and that's it. It can't happen like that. It is a process that goes on from one place to another, from one group of the society to another, from one issue to another. So it's a very time-bound. Reconciliation is a process. The second thing is reconciliation to be a last long, you need an authority. Without authority, whatever that authority is, whether that is state, whether that is traditional elders, group of traditional elders, clansmen, whether that's religious figures who the people believe, but there must be some sort of authority that makes sure that once reconciled, we do not relapse back. Here I'm giving another good experience that I was part of it in early times. In parts of central regions of Somalia, two neighboring clans were fighting each other. And that fight was extending some 400 kilometers, distance of 400 kilometers. So this clan, they moved back, and this clan, they moved back. So there is a huge piece of land, territory, which is no man's land. People are not, livestock is not grazing there. Water walls there, nobody is using. So everybody ran away. So after a lot of effort of making reconciliation, at the end, it's a long process, it took a couple of months, they agreed. They said, we agreed. They settled all the pending issues among them, they agreed. Now they come back. They come back to the grazing area for their livestock, they come back to the water wells again to their livestock. What happened then? One young boy, he saw a man who he suspects that he was the person who killed his father. He killed the man, that young boy. In a modern world where there is a rule of law, we called that young boy a murderer. And we took him to the court of law. In that context, that boy is not he himself. It's Clan X who killed Clan Y. And the word immediately, it went virally, very far distances. Someone else was killed that part, another one was killed that part, the whole thing comes back again. Why? Because there is no authority that controls this thing and calls this man the murderer and takes him to the court of law. So again, it started the whole thing again from scratch, but this time it took less time. And so when you are making reconciliation, these are the two important things that you need to recognize it as a process, and there must be an authority. That authority not necessarily to be the state. It was clear to us that that point there was something missing in the toolkit that we're using. Yes, some toolkit will say you need reconciliation, you need forgiveness, you need so many things. But what's missing was that two important aspects. And above all, trust. How can you build the trust? People who have been fighting each other for 10 years, who killed a lot of people, who banned villages. How can you bring back and make them in our level, in my position? How can you convince it that the militia of yesterday, of Clan X or Clan Y, today is the policeman who will protect you, who will help you when you need help? How can you make the people accept that? It's a big challenge. The next is the woman, the mother or the father or the young boy who knows that Mr. So-and-so was the militia of Clan X of yesterday. How the policeman, because you do not invent new people, you do not bring people from Mars. This is the people who are going to be the police, are going to be the judges. So this boy who was militia yesterday, but today is a policeman, how he himself make believe that now you are a policeman, you serve the people, you protect the people, but these faces are Clan X who have been fighting with us for 10 years. So you know both sides, and this is the challenge in that post-conflict environment mainly. But trust is very important. These stories I'm telling you illustrate several aspects of the main issues facing not just Somalia, but I do argue any country emerging from conflict, trying to resurrect a country that has been engrossed in conflict, which has destroyed everything from institutions to trust of the people, is that you constantly have to hold two tensions together. One is, what do we need to do to solve problem? And that problem is what? It's not one. It's a long list of problems. And the second is, what do we need to build foundations for the future? You cannot build foundation for the future without having a trust to the state, without having trust among the people. This is the challenges that always are. How do you prioritize? How you make the priorities of the people? You go through, someone will say we need education. Another group will say, no, we need water, clean water. We have diarrhea, we have cholera emerging in the hot seasons, we need water. Others will say, no, this is not, we need a policeman to protect us. So all these long list of demands, how can you make a priority out of it? Compounding this issue, all these complex issues that are surrounding is when there is a group of terrorists who are ruthless, who doesn't recognize clan, who doesn't recognize relatives, who only believe that this is the ideology we believe. Anybody who is within this ideology is good, anybody who is not this ideology is good. And they are mainly playing this in the rural area, not in the major towns. In the rural area, they collect zakat, they collect taxation system, their own have, claiming that clans, we protect you. We, particularly the minority clans, we protect you from this big clan who has been abusing you in the past couple of decades. When I became the president in 2012, I was very much optimistic, however, with all this reality. I never went outside Somalia throughout. I was living there from day one. I didn't left Somalia all these years. I was there. And I was working in the education, in the civil society, and these issues are always been involved, traveling here and there, sometimes working with the United Nations. When I became president, I was optimistic. I thought we were able to offer a compelling vision, at least convince the people that, look, I know you have this difficulty, you have that difficulty. you have that difficulty, but this is where we are going. This is where we're reaching. Somalis will respond, and the international community will support that vision we have been dreaming. And that was a very clear vision, which we call it the six pillars, the foundations of new beginning, which we started with those 6 pillars as priority areas among the long list of important things. So we had spent time in the lead up of forming a government, taking a look at what had happened in other countries emerging from conflict as experience sharing. We tried to learn from the problems that other fragile states are facing and encountering, which is difficult when you are in Somalia, because Somalia's case was very, very unique compared to many cases. Somalia, as I said earlier, there was no a winner in the conflict of Somalia. And there was no a very strong international partner who was standing with it, like, for example, what United Kingdom did for Sierra Leone, or what the French did for Cambodia. There is always, in every collapsed state, there is no one single country who did it by itself. There is always some sort of international support, whether that's bilateral or multilateral. Yes, a lot of attempts have been made at the multilateral level in Somalia, but it didn't work. It didn't work, and it was the case of Black Hawk Down was one. There was a good opportunity, missed opportunity in early 1990s when United Nations, United States government, almost all European Union governments went there to pacify Somalia. But some of the warlords they were not ready to take the peace, and they fight. And this is what has happened, and the international community abandoned Somalia. So the experience of other countries in many areas was not applicable. It turned out to be we were not the only ones with ideas of how best to start reestablish Somalia. There were other countries, other friends who had some deep thinking about this too. Let me give another example. The Germans had undertaken a pretty decent needs assessment in Somalia in early 1980s when everything was stable. The issue of 1980s was development. There was no civil war, there was no crisis. So this was the time where the German government made an assessment to support Somalia, to build a whole program and fund it with $80 million. That $80 million never come to Somalia, because before it came, the collapse has happened in 1989, civil war started, and 1990 the collapse happened. That money was bought somewhere in Germany, and it was there. When we came to the office as a government that's not transition, they came to us and they said, we have 80 million for Somalia. That 80 million was there almost 25 years. And we were very happy to accept and said, thank you, bring it. But you know, that package was designed and developed 25 years ago. The environment of 25 years ago, the situation of 25 years ago, which was completely different from the situation of 2012. And it was not flexible. Although the German diplomats in Somalia have tried their best to convince their government that this is not applicable now, it was very difficult to modify and convince the German government so that this will be, the priorities are changed, everything is new now. And until today, that $80 million never come to Somalia because of that differences that we had. The donors, in general, they make a very impressive commitment to Somalia. In early 2013, there was a New Deal conference in Brussels, Belgium. And the European Union pledged $3 billion for the reconstruction of Somalia. And this was very clear and loud. They said, this money is not for humanitarian. This money is for the reconstruction of Somalia. So there was a pledge. Every country, we pay 50 million, we pay 100 million, we pay 600 million, we pay, so all put together, euros of course, all to put together it is equivalent of $3 billion. We agreed some sort of mechanism that how this is going to be useful to the Somali state. Because in our time, early 2013 was, how can you make in the eyes of the Somali citizen that the state is relevant? While the state has no budget, while the state does not control all the territory, while the state cannot provide services to the people, how can you make the ordinary citizen, most of them uneducated people, that there is something called a state which you need? Why do I need? That's a big question. The other thing is that we federalized Somalia, we established federal member states and the federal governments, the central government. Now, in that environment where the trust is that much low, what incentive do I have as the president of Somalia, or my government has, for the federal member states outside the capital? Once you cannot support, once you cannot help them to solve some of their problems. If they have a problem, financial problem, you cannot provide them finance. If they have a security problem, you cannot provide them. So what makes them, what attracts them to the center? And then this is where the international community comes. They said, aid is not politicized. Aid must not be politicized. So if we give, or if we consult, or if we give role to the government will politicize. So we directly go to the people. So these periphery administrations, they have all the access to it. USAID is going to build a hospital, they go directly to them. DFID wants to build a school, they go directly to them without passing through the federal government or the central government. So in the eyes of those people, what's the useful? Why do I need a central government that stays there in the capital, which cannot provide some of our needs? This was the problem. So the architect of international aid needs, according to our view, needs some sort of review. Many of those architects was developed after the Second World War. Decades have passed, situations have changed. Aid has been developed for less developed countries, fragile countries. But what about the post-conflict? People who have been fighting for decades, how can you sustain? So the international architect of aid and development both needs a very good review of it. Somalia was one of the best countries who have received the largest amount for the New Deal. In almost all post-conflict environment, there is a New Deal that have been pledged. And pledge and reality is completely different. Two different things. Somalia was one of the best we have because we received $8 to $12 million out of the amount that has been pledged into the government system, into the government treasury, into the government budget. That was there. The rest never come to the government budget. It has been given to the international NGOs, local NGOs, other multilateral, United Nations, other multilateral institutions, which has their own priorities, their own agendas, not the priorities of Somalia, not the priorities of the people. Every international NGO, every multilateral institution like United Nations agencies, UNICEF, UNDP, FAO, WHO, you name it, all of them, they have a global agenda, which sometimes is not compatible with the local agenda of the individual countries. So sometimes you get difficult. And then the voice of the post-conflict countries is not loud enough, but these agencies, they have bigger and bigger, and then sometimes it goes back as a diplomatic, and then you'll see many countries, many diplomats coming to you saying, how can you help, how can we help these people, while their leaders are not. We are not rejecting, but this is not the way. This is not the way was a big question that has been asked to many people. Development happened in many areas, but it happened not with the state in charge. It happens in some others, and when it happens outside the framework of the state, that development is not sustainable. The question of sustainable development now comes into. Everything is project. School is project, school is built, salaries are paid to the teachers and the administrators for a couple of years. When the project ends, the international community leaves, and the people who have been paid by them leaves as well. So the project will not be there anymore. With the critical countries like Somalia, the issue of legitimacy is another big question in the eyes of the ordinary citizens, as well as in the eyes of the, as well as in the eyes of the international community. I'm sure you read a lot in the books, what they call it, the sovereign gap. When you cannot provide yourself certain criteria, certain elements, when the state cannot provide certain services, then you are categorized as a country that has got a sovereign gap. And by having that itself again produces another effect which is very critical. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not, and I do not mean you to understand that the international community was either ill-intentioned or was not useful. They have provided, or they have not provided any benefits to the Somali people. No, far from it. The international community has also been very good in many ways. Without the support of the African Union mission in Somalia, we would not have reclaimed many territories from Al-Shabaab during my presidency in particular. Without the support of the World Bank, we would not have the post-public financial management system reform that we undertook during those years. Without the tireless effort and support of the DFID, the USAID, SIDA, GIZ, all of them, we would not have been able to respond during multiple drought, famine, flooding, all those emergencies that were happening. Without the support of those international agencies, it would have been very, very difficult. There are schools that are open. Sustainability, but all this is questionable, but there are very good number of schools that were opened because of the support of those international agencies. I'm also heartened by UNICEF, United Nations Children Fund, so opening an office in Mogadishu a couple of weeks, and their commitment to being on our side of the fence. They are coming outside the fence I was talking into the town, establishing their own office to support the schools. After 23 years in 2013, we established the first public school, a program we call it Go to School, where we have envisioned to bring back to this public schools 3 million students. Yes, it was not possible for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, but we started. For the first time, the budget of the government in 2014, there were 1,500 primary school teachers in the budget and in the government salary, payroll, which was not there for over 23 years. We have reopened the first public university, Somali National University, after the collapse. That university has got 10 faculties, and they are giving free education to a couple thousand students inside Somalia. Schools, when I left the office, there were 250,000 students going to school, public schools, without paying a tuition fee at the end of the month. So things come, of course, millions of Somalis need schools and millions of Somalis need universities, but this was the beginning for getting there. So this was the support of the international community in many areas, but from less than $60 million, a budget of $60 million a year, the Somali government has got close to $300 million budget in 2017. And 2018 is even expected to be more. So I came to the office September 2012. So that was almost the last quarter. October, November, December, we have the last quarter of the year. That was the first time ever after the collapse that a budget was developed, taken to the parliament, endorsed it, and implemented, and then went back to the parliament for its accountants. All this gratefulness for the Somali people as well as the international, my gratefulness does not obscure my observation. What I was telling and sharing with you is the observation, what we have seen in the ground, that the architecture of international system is completely unworld and it needs a big review. We can no longer sustain spending of 2/3 of the global aid budget on post-disaster, rather than adequately funding disaster mitigation before things happen, the disaster. How many millions have been spent when recently there was a tsunami and earthquake in Indonesia, and how much money the international community has spent in Indonesia for the mitigation of, because that's a country where earthquakes, tsunamis are always there. What is the mitigation mechanism in place before the disaster has happened? The speed of today's world renders its acute lack of flexibility and nimbleness acute. The boomerang nature of funding system, its reliance on of course, the Northern expertise, its homage to the Northern think tanks, reflecting Northern way of thinking only, is endless bureaucracy. None of these things are sustainable in the post-conflict environment, in the fragile states, in what we used to call sometime back the third world. If the international aid and democracy architecture is to survive, then it must be reshaped again. It must be reviewed. It must be redrawn in some aspects. First and foremost, of course, with Somalia in mind, what we need to see is a couple of things. Putting the why before the how. How we deliver, because as I said earlier, the international aid organizations, they have their own agenda when they're coming, global agenda. They want to implement that global agenda, whether it's in Somalia or Afghanistan or in Uganda or in whatever place. That international agenda they come with, without making it the real. So they immediately start, how can we implement? How can we do? Who is there? Are there local NGOs there? Can we deal with them? How? So the question of how is always in their mind, without the question of why. Why do we do this? What are we expecting? What outcome are we going to? How do we measure those outcomes? And when you said what outcome do we need, then you are compelled to go to the ground and ask the people what is their priorities, what's their problems. So putting the why before the how is a serious challenge that international community has. The second is not trying to build space shuttle by redesigning old car. What fits in where and when is very important. A fit for purpose is essential. Each country has to be looked at through its own lenses. There is no one size fits all in this world today. Models from other countries can be useful, but they cannot be the one that you can just copy, replicate, do it like that. It doesn't work in that. We need to think more carefully about adapting for unique circumstances and investing time and resources into understanding what is there in the ground. what's missing, what's available in the ground. So that's also very, very important. Number 3 is allowing room to fail. If we want not to fail, and if we do expect that after 2 decades of conflict, everything will be perfect, transparent, accountable, democratic, it will be very, very difficult for anything to happen. So I do not advocate that a constant failure or failure at all, but there must be some level of tolerance acceptable. As far as we learn from our failure, failure is acceptable. As far as we accept, as far as we learn from the failure, as far as the failure is minimal, not most of the whole thing. There is an inherent risk in helping a country to stabilize itself. How many countries that we try to stabilize and then we make them even worse in many situations? Home countries' political will changes very quickly. In post-conflict environment, nothing is going to, it changes. So there's sometimes predictability, planning, all this is very difficult, not easy. Political cycles and upheavals are always there in that environment. So you need to be very flexible when you are supporting in a country like that situation. Coherence rather than competition. Many times the international NGOs or international organizations, because of security situation, they use local NGOs. And local NGOs, you do not expect from them, when they come to this village and they see that school is already built here, to go back and say, oh, the school was built, so there is a school in the village that you were willing to, oh, okay, bring the funds back, we will think something else. No, they will not. They will build another school there. Or they will build another school somewhere close to it, while maybe the next 100 kilometers there's no school at all. So how can we make the people or the organizations that are funding the support that they are sure that this is going to be the right place? So this is what makes this is very important, is the data. How much data are there? Particularly, governments, they cannot work without data. And there is no data. All the records have been destroyed during the civil war. There is no record in a place like Somalia. No record. There are only 2 institutions that their record was saved. One was the Somali police force, which their headquarters was not looted and taken. Everything was there, available. And the other one was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That was the only 2 institutions that their records were intact after the civil war. The rest, everything has been destroyed, either banned or looted or whatever. So we don't know. The government has the capacity to establish now the data center, national data center and collective data center. For 20 years, a lot of data can be collected, but there was no the means. But the internationals, when they realized that this is the case, now they go. Because, the internationals, they have the financial capacity and they have the technical capacity. They can hire whatever capacity, local capacity was existing in the ground, while the government cannot hire, because the government has no funds to hire the best minds, the best brains available in the country. So the international community and the international agencies like the United Nations Development, UNDP, or as I say, DFID or USAID, they, in order to make now things happen, they develop a lot of data. But the problem is that data is theirs. It's not for the government. So there is a government in place, wanted to plan and has no data. How can we make a plan? So it only took us a couple of years to get some, not all, some of the data. And we produced the first national plan in 2016. The first ever national plan after the collapse of the state, after 26 years. On major reason why we were recently, the government has established a Center for Statistics. So things are now coming up gradually, but mainly that was the process. So there is no, we compete to each other instead of we cooperate. If I have a piece of data, share with you that this is what I have. This is what's with me. That would have helped a lot, but it's not. In reality, it doesn't happen like that. Somalia is a resourceful country, particularly the natural resources, oil and gas. There was a lot of exploration, a lot of seismic surveys in Somalia in the last 50 years, 60 years. There are a couple of international oil companies that was signed a contract with the government before the collapse in the 1980s and 70s. Since after the civil war, all the data was destroyed. We don't know which company contracted to which block or which area or which where. We don't know what were the terms that the past government has agreed with them. So we wrote a letter to, first of all, we recognize those contractors are still legitimate because of force majeure. Civil wars have happened, that's force majeure, so we accepted that. But we asked them to give us the data. They never did it. So we were compelled to hire again seismic agencies to make the data and establish our own data center for these hydrocarbons. Finally, I cannot speak of Somalia alone without speaking Africa in general. I'm sure that many of you have seen the steering speech on behalf of the African ownership by the president of Ghana, Nana Akufo, when he was receiving or making a press conference with the president of France, Macron, in Ghana. I truly believe that Somalia has all the ideas and energy we need within ourselves. That president, he presented to the French president the challenges that Africa is facing, many of which Somalia shares with that, and its public domain is available on the internet if you go through. And I am very confident at the end that Somalia will prevail and will do this. I look forward to playing my part in making this happen with a young, vibrant, entrepreneurial population, the longest coastline that we have, the fertile soils and the rivers we have, the mineral wealth that we have, Somalia strategic location that it's located in the world. All this put together, Somalia has a greater chance to revive and to become and be part of the international community. Again, I would like to say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to introduce to you the challenges and the potentialities of Somalia. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll just take one or two questions from the audience quickly before we have to go. I recognise the gentleman here in the grey jumper and the pink shirt.
Looking at the long-term prospects for defeating Shabab, do you think that's something that can arise from endogenous strengthening as tribes reconcile, as the institutions deepen, or do you think ultimately you still need greater external support from the AU, from the UN?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, Al-Shabaab, as I said, is a phenomena that exists in Somalia, is an ideological organization. Well, it's very difficult to defeat Al-Shabaab with conventional war. Not only Al-Shabaab, but any terrorist, local terrorists. But what we have done was, when we come to the office in 2012, Al-Shabaab was very close to the State House. They were not very far away. But at the end, we pushed them back to the rural area, take over most of the towns and cities. They are still there, and their impact will be felt even if we defeat or even we reconcile with them for the long years to come. We've offered a number of times a reconciliation. We offered a number of times dialogue. But unfortunately, so far, they have not positively responded. But the reality, the experience shows us they cannot be defeated with a conventional war. Their capacity can be reduced their role can be reduced, but to eliminate them 100%, it won't be easy. It takes long years and it needs out-of-the-box thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, taking one more. Yes, the gentleman over here.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much for your time and for your update. Somalia officially became a federal government in 2012 after a new professional constitution was adopted. And since then, the federalism appears to be central to today's Somalia. The word federal itself appears 710 times in Article 1 of the 2012 professional constitution. And many Somalis, as you're aware, feel that the type of federalism being promoted in Somalia is a foreign initiative and is being imposed rather than consented by the people. And it legitimizes territorial location for clan ownership, and it does not recognize concept of citizenship. One of the astonishing fallacy about the federalism in Somalia is that the claim that Somalis did not reconcile but agreed a collective on constitutional federalism, and many Somalis disagree about whether federalism is recipe for state building and peace building, and even whether such a system is practical or if federal. So my question is federalism in Somalia the best direction for states like Somalia, and is federalism solution for Somalia's prolonged problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you expressed some points very rightly. Somalia, you know, when there is a state in place, the state has to function according to the rules that have been put in place, according to the constitution that is in place. So the Somalis have agreed long time to be a federal country, federated country. Why the Somalis opted the federal system is a different question, but the reality is that Somalis have agreed to be the country to be federated, number one. Number two, geographically, when you talk about Somalia, if you talk about a particular area, region, district, whatever, indirectly you're talking about a clan. When you said region X, you're talking about clan X. Either one clan is in that region, or there are a couple of clans, but there is always one major clan who dominates the others. So geographically, it's there. Somalis, they live in that type of thing. So the only way to establish a federation was to say, in 1991, when the state was collapsing, there were 18 regions in Somalia, 18 regions. So the constitution says 2 or more regions, if they join together voluntarily, they can become a federal member state, 2 or more. So this was what would we come. When I come to the office, this was the constitution that was there, and these were the people. And immediately the people, they started negotiating and dialogue among them to establish their own federal member state. So the government has no choice but to facilitate. Government has no choice but to facilitate technically, to facilitate seeking international support for that. So that was how it established it. I don't think that the federalism in Somalia is inherently bad, no. It all depends on how the leadership, how the vision of the leadership sees the federalism. We established the federalism, the federal member states, but the states are there, but they need some sort of capacitating. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources, they don't have, so many weaknesses are there. And that is the only way that the governance can be expanded throughout the country. Otherwise, if we say we remain central government that leaves from Mogadishu, expands itself from Mogadishu all the way to the 637,000 square kilometers of Somalia, one of the reasons, Al-Shabaab is an ideological organization. And ideology has no citizenship and has no territory. Why Al-Shabaab is Somali? Because in Somalia, there is a wide territories that were ungoverned for a long time. And that's where they breed. That's where they establish their training center. That's where they established bomb-making factories. That's where they established everything. So in order to fill the gap, the best option was to make the federal state, member states establish it in different. Today, there is a responsibility, someone who is responsible every single inch of territory in Somalia. Yes, that someone has no capacity, we can say. That someone does not control everything, we can say. But there is someone to call and say what's going on there. Before, it was not there. 2,000 kilometers away from Mogadishu. What can you do without having someone there? And shall we? Yes, we Somalis, we have the experience of highly centralized government, where the elementary teacher or the nurse or the policeman has to be transferred from Mogadishu to all corners of Somalia. That era has gone now. People has to decide their own self. The people have to have the say on their own destiny. Where are they going? So, and that's the only way to, the only available platform was the federalism. Yes, decentralization, other ideas are there, but this is what the people have agreed long time. And there's no reason now that the Somali people will now agree that we don't want federalism. If we question the federalism, we create a divisive environment when again the country and the people will divide among themselves, because there are people who, the people I told now, the people who were afraid, who fear, by saying that these are the major clans who dominated us. Now when they hear there is no federalism, again they wanted to dominate us, again they wanted to take our property, again they wanted to rule us, again they want to abuse us. So the only thing that the country can come back now, after another 50 years, what's going to happen is completely something else. But today, if we question in Somalia the federalism, we create a divisive environment where the country and the people will divide among themselves.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But that was an absolutely fascinating talk and a real immense honour for us to hear the detailed explanation from your experiences. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.